All right. So first things first, just wanted to go over the meeting agenda real quick, cover what our objectives are today. So last month we had a pretty full meeting, lots of ground to cover, lots of detail to introduce everyone to the project and where we're headed. This month, I think it'll be more of a typical kind of meeting. We probably won't need our full 2 hours. And what we're shooting for today is, one, I would just want to do a really quick recap of what we talked about last time, since we do have a few people here today that weren't here last month, and we're just still trying to get everybody up to speed on what's going on. So I'll just, bear with me for 5 minutes or so while I go over that information one more time. And then we have two big things to accomplish today. One, I want to conduct an exercise with everybody to kind of capture, some of our best outcomes, our hopes for best outcomes, and what some of our worst fears for this project going forward. Something that we can, record for posterity. It'll go into our final document. And then secondly, we're going to discuss some methodology. I sent out some documents to you all that had some of that information. If you had time to look at it, great. If not, don't worry about it. We'll talk about it today, but going over methodology for how we might assess the remaining vulnerabilities that we talked about last time. So, of course, this is an estuarine resilience action plan. So we're trying to develop a plan that outlines adaptation actions to improve resilience on the Oregon coast in Tillamook County estuary specifically. So the first thing that we're going to do is try and figure out where our remaining vulnerabilities are that need to be assessed, and then how we want to figure that out. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And finally, I just put a placeholder in the agenda that says good of the order. So if there's anything else that is for the good of the order that you want to bring up or want to discuss, that's our opportunity to do so. But if there's nothing more to discuss, then we'll adjourn early once we're done. And I padded out the agenda a bit here, so we'll see if we really need an hour and a half to do that. A couple of matters of business here up front. One is, don't forget to fill out your time tracking Excel spreadsheet that I sent around previously. So anytime that you are meeting with me or in the group meetings or reviewing documents, answering emails, keep track of that in that spreadsheet. And when I need to collect that to report it to NIFWIF, I will do so. Okay, just a few review points from last month. One, we talked about holding a regular standing meeting every month. So we settled on the third Wednesday of the month from 9 to 11, so that would be today. And I did send around a calendar invite. It seems most of you should have gotten that. And I only scheduled out the next 6 months just to see how things go as far as the day and the time. And if that continues to work, then I'll project ahead on the calendar and extend that. But for the next few months, these are the dates that we are looking at to meet. And so if you can't meet on a given meeting, no problem, just let me know. I can always meet with you independently. We'll also make the recordings available and all the meeting materials and a meeting summary at the end of it. All right, so I just want to take a few minutes here to give a super fast overview of what it is we're doing with this project for the benefit of those who maybe forgot all the details or who weren't here last month. So Department of Land Conservation and Development, DLCD, my agency, we successfully were awarded a grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to conduct this work. And it's a pilot project. We're developing estuarine resilience action plans in Tillamook County and in Coos County. So this is focused on the estuarine areas in those counties. And we're doing that. The way we're doing is we're putting together these working groups. So you're our working group for Tillamook County, the Partnership for Coastal Watersheds, which is an existing group in Coos County, is overseeing development for the Coos County plan. And we're going to outline a list of specific adaptation action projects that we can aim to initiate or complete in the near future. And to do that, we've broken the project down into 3 phases. Phase 1, our estuarine resilience needs assessment. So that's where we're at the moment. And that's where we're going to assess all the planning work that's been done locally, and then figure out where the gaps are and assess the remaining sensitivities, vulnerabilities, risks, so that we can start to formulate our adaptation action strategy. Phase 2, our estuarine resilience activity analyses, is kind of a catch-all term, but what it means is we're going to take all that information about the vulnerabilities, the sensitivities, the risks, and we're going to start to formulate some potential actions and strategies that we can take to address those specific vulnerabilities. So at the end of that, we'll have an adaptation action workshop with some of our other stakeholders and participants that will help us identify or narrow down the list of what the actions are that we want to take, what the benefits and costs of those individual actions are, and so to help formulate our final list, which we'll outline in phase 3, where we have that final list of these are all the projects that we're going to aim for. These are the goals and priorities for each of those. These are the timelines and milestones for each of those, with really the end goal here to tee up the ball for folks to get the funding that they need to move forward and break ground on some of these projects. One caveat there too is that it doesn't have to be a project that hasn't been initiated yet. This could be projects that are midway through in the design phase, the permitting phase, whatever it might be. Also, I want to point out too, I'll remind people probably several times today that, we're not, while some of the biggest hazards that are ever present are climate change related, we're not going to narrow our scope to simply climate change impacts. Could be any hazards that are faced on the coast. So we're developing this plan for Tillamook County estuaries, the 6 estuaries in Tillamook County, and it'll be driven by you folks, local representatives, local stakeholders, who can really tell us where we should focus our efforts. And we'll be including additional partners and stakeholders who can participate in this process. We'll talk a little bit about that in our methods later today. So one of the expectations from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation is that whatever our projects are, that they rely on natural or green infrastructure. So we talked a lot about that last time. So just a reminder, natural or green infrastructure are things that don't rely on necessarily the gray infrastructure, built infrastructure, but it mimics natural areas, primarily to do things like slow and absorb and redirect floodwaters. They do this by reducing wave height, attenuating wave energy. So it can be things like the list of options you see there on the screen. And they can also provide benefits that are not flood related as well. So water quality improvements, air quality improvements, help with things like excessive wind, heat, or drought. But flooding is often the focus, and I imagine for much of our efforts in Tillamook, it'll definitely be the focus. And so we're doing this with an eye toward the existing kind of ecosystem of planning, as I like to call it, that exists in Tillamook County right now. So a lot of these things I know many of you have contributed to, and so that's part of the reason why you're participating in this process now. So we have the natural hazard mitigation plan for Tillamook. There's also a vulnerability assessment done by our lead partner, Tillamook Estuaries Partnership. The Oregon Central Coast Estuary Collaborative Strategic Action Plan outlined or assessed some vulnerabilities and outlined a lot of potential adaptation actions as well. So there's a lot of planning work that's already been done, and we want to minimize duplication of efforts as much as possible. And so as we go forward with our vulnerability assessment, we're trying to just fill the gaps where some of these plans might have had a particular focus. So we want to identify where where can we still assess some vulnerability and get a sense of where we want to plan for, what we want to plan for. So that will be kind of the focus moving ahead in the next few months here. All right, any questions about the project overall from any folks? All right. So the first real order of process today is going to be this best outcomes and worst fears exercise. And give me one moment here. I'm juggling a lot of spinning plates. I'm going to drop a link in the chat for you to a Google Jamboard. And I don't know if anyone has done this before, but it's kind of a fun way that we can collaborate some ideas and brainstorm together. All right, so I dropped a link in the chat. It should go to the Jamboard, and I'm going to switch screens while everybody's pulling that up. All right, I see lots of folks joining. That's great. Perfect. All right. Yes, thank you, Colin. So at the top of the screen, you see here, you can navigate to the different pages or slides on this Jamboard. But on the first page here are some instructions for everybody. So the controls over here, you can click on sticky note. So as we go through this, just create a sticky note and to jot your ideas down and place them on the board wherever you feel is appropriate. So you can click the left and right arrows here to navigate through them and add your ideas as we go through this. So for this exercise, we're just going to use the next two pages, and that's going to be best outcomes and worst fears. So what I want to do is everybody to kind of brainstorm about as we go through this project over the next year and a half-ish, what are some of your the best outcomes that you hope for, and what are some of the worst fears that you have? And I've kind of put some dimensions around there that we can kind of categorize these things under. So, for example, process. So you could say, well, I want an efficient process that's cost effective. That would be a best outcome that you could hope for. Or impacts, you could say, well, I want to see, on the ground impacts that'll materially improve conditions or whatever. So things like that. Some of these might be a little clearer than others, and feel free to add your own. But let's take a few minutes now to go ahead and add some sticky notes with your thoughts on best outcomes and worst fears.
So
and
Moses,
we can talk about those. Yeah.
Okay, so I wrote a sticky note, but how do I get my sticky note onto your screen?
It should show up.
So I'm using a sticky note over here. No?
Let's see which screen you're on. You are on the first slide, so you'll have to scroll to the second slide with those arrows at the top.
Copy that. Thank you.
So, but I don't think that sticky note you made will carry over, but that's a really good one. So you could copy and paste it. And go ahead and feel free to explain some of your thinking behind some of these. And why it might be, why you prioritize a particular outcome or fear. So at the end, I'll consolidate all of these into a table that we will put in the final plan.
Hey, are we supposed to be doing this on page 1 or page 2?
Page 2 and 3.
Okay.
And go ahead and just kind of arrange the sticky notes however you see fit. So I see, there we go. Wide participation, absolutely. And we're going to talk about broadening our participation a little bit today with the methods. Materials.
I'm sorry.
Go
I
ahead.
put mine down to coordination with the Tillamook County Multi-Jurisdictional National Hazard Mitigation Plan. That's something a lot of us worked on, and Sarah Absher with the county is getting that going again. And a lot of the things in there deal with the flooding and all the other stuff that are gonna kind of cross connect with some of what we're trying to accomplish here.
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. That's a big one because you know, one of the biggest sources of funding for any potential projects is going to come from FEMA, and they have certain requirements for proposed projects that you know, we will be able to you know, determine what some of those aspects that need to be reported for any sort of proposal. So that will align well with the natural hazard mitigation plan and with our work, and so we can really tee up the ball for funding on that one. I see materials for landowners to encourage tidal wetland restoration. That would be really great. We could develop some outreach materials. Let's see. Bay City needs to relocate our WWTP outfall in our next DEQ permit cycle that starts in. What's WWTP? Wastewater treatment plant, is that correct?
Yes, so currently we actually discharge to the bay, but our outfall is in the mud, and DEQ has told us that we need to move our outfall about 4,500 feet into the bay. This will be a big deal for us, and about $5 million.
Oof. See, I'm gonna move.
I just wanted to double check. So this is outcomes for this planning process, or this is outcomes for, you know, ultimately what the projects that will come out of this planning process?
Both is fine. You know,
Okay.
primarily outcomes for this planning process. You know, at the end of it, we'll have our estuarine resilience action plan. And so what do we want to be the outcomes there? But, you know, ultimately what we really want to see more than the plan is that some of these projects are implemented. So that would be, in my view, the ultimate success is that the plan was implemented on the ground and we see material changes.
Thanks.
Actionable steps to achieve goals. Absolutely. I'll take a look at the worst fears slide as well. Infrastructure failing, leaving communities isolated. That's a very valid concern. Absolutely. North County only no reps from Nestucca, Nesquin, Sand Lake. Absolutely. We're trying to include as broad of a stakeholder representation as we can.
They just hired a new coordinator, so I would recommend reaching back out to them again and
Great.
getting Dave, I believe is his name, involved.
Dave.
I can send you his email if you like. It's
Yes, that would be great.
It's the same coordinator email they've had. It's just a new person responding to it.
Perfect. Yeah, I think when we spoke last time, it was that they were still in the process of hiring. So I've been kind of waiting on that. So it'd be nice if we got one or two more watershed councils participating here.
I actually serve on the Nestucca-Nesquin board, and Dave is in, and he's working crazy to catch up and get on board. But I'm sure he'd be glad to participate in this process if you send him another email.
Sure, that'd be great.
Know. Yeah.
So I see a significant planning effort without support from landowners or agencies not represented here, preventing implementation. Absolutely. You know, the intention here is to be a bottom-up, locally driven process. So, you know, if we've left out some major or significant sector, you know, that's not our goal. Let's get back to best outcomes. So don't forget to put some stuff on the worst fears slide as well, just so we have a little bit more information to fill out on our table. So,
You know, I missed the first hour of our last meeting, and so we're planning resilience, and flooding is one of the biggest issues. Are we talking climate change or the Cascadia subduction zone type events? Are we, how far in the future are we planning, or how far are we looking, and what are we? I guess I need that kind of context.
sure, yeah. Well, all hazards are on the table, are fair game. You know, I think it's really easy to think about climate change hazards because there's a lot of talk about them. A lot of work has been done to understand them and to quantify them. But you know, there's many other hazards that to be concerned about as well, like you mentioned, the Cascadia subduction zone event. You know, that's something we can plan for. But any other hazards that that you're aware of that specifically threaten estuaries, assets, natural resources within Tillamook estuarine zones are fair game for us to plan for. And so at the end of it, you know, that's the goal, is to have that a plan outlined of a list of specific projects that we can move forward with implementation on to address some of those hazards and improve resiliency to those hazards. But with an eye toward natural infrastructure solutions. Natural processes improve to benefit resources while improving human environment as well. We have estuary and shoreline code update, clarification for Bracey. That's a good one too. So that's interestingly, this falls under the broad umbrella of natural infrastructure solutions. Is simply updating code or rezoning areas can qualify. Working with ongoing project agencies such as ACE on the ongoing Tillamook Bay and Bar Jetty restoration and dredging project. Yeah. See what's going on. Okay, worst fears. Duplicating efforts by other groups. Yep, this is a big concern of mine. We certainly don't want to you know, exhaust our stakeholders by having them do same kinds of work over and over again. That's why we'll talk about our vulnerability assessment next. You know, we're going to be really limited in scope on our vulnerability assessment, so since so much of that work has already been done for Tillamook. So we're just going to try and fill in the gaps, do a little bit of a quick and dirty assessment over the next couple months, and then move forward with some of our assessments and planning for projects. Plan doesn't lead to adequate funding and implementation. Absolutely a big concern. So one of the things I'll be keeping in the back of my mind and reminding everybody about throughout the process is what some of the major funding sources are that we can target, and what some of their requirements are, so that we can kind of hopefully structure some of those requirements into our planning process. So if they say a particular project, you need to so for the FEMA BRIC and HAZMAT grants, or HAZUS grants, they want you to demonstrate a history of a repeated event, so like a flooding frequency. So that's something that we can try and build into our planning to say, you know, well, area X has this history of flooding, and here's the flooding projections for the next few decades. And so this is why we need to implement this project to mitigate that flooding concern. And so in that way, we would help to meet that requirement for the FEMA grant application. But it kind of depends on you all and what the projects are and what some of the funding sources are that we'd prefer to target.
Michael, it looks like some people still have Post-it notes back on the first page
Oh.
that probably need to be drug over here.
Oh, yeah. Let's see. Not sure I can carry them over. Might just have to copy and paste.
And Moses, I actually I redid mine for the wastewater or outfall, but I didn't get it off the first page. So if you can
No
just
worries.
delete it off the first page, that'd be fine. I redid that.
There we go. Thank you. All right, we'll just give it a couple more minutes here. This is looking pretty good though. I'm liking how filled out it is. Try and put down at least one on both slides if you can. I do like seeing a little bit more on best outcomes. We have a little bit more of a positive view on things. Worst fears, let's see, what else do we have? Significant planning effort without support from land. Oh, we already said that one. Jurisdictional agencies not support projects. That's a big one. So we do have participation. We have our ODFW partners here, and I know we have interest and awareness at a couple of our other agencies, so PRD and DSL. So we could certainly loop them in when we need to. Condition of the estuary leads to bad economic outcomes. So that's a big one. I don't want people to forget about the economies, local economies, and ways we can make them more resilient, because that's one of the sectors that we'll be potentially evaluating or thinking and talking about. Because I know for natural resources, natural assets, a lot of that, that's where a lot of the work that's been done in Tillamook has focused. But we can also evaluate some resiliencies in other sectors. And so similar.
Share a little bit?
Yeah.
Oh, could you share a little bit about what you were thinking for the tools part of both of these?
Sure. Yeah. Colin and I had a discussion yesterday about it. We're like, I'm not sure that that's the best dimension to include, but we couldn't come up with anything better. But, just thinking about best outcomes, like what are some of the tools that we can use in this process, or that we would want to see used in this process to ensure that it's a robust process. So for an example would be the vulnerability assessment tool, and to make sure that we did that we did it in a particular way, or that it included certain aspects or dimensions. So something like that, or worst fear to say that, oh, well, we didn't develop, some other tool, or I guess tool is really the best word, but so say something like some sort of outreach material. Say, well, I wouldn't want us to not have some sort of outreach, or like say a social media presence or something, for example, as a tool that maybe it would be excluded from the process or maybe misused in the process. So I don't know. It wasn't the greatest dimension, I'll admit that. So don't worry about it too much.
So Moses, I've never seen this tool used before in any of my Zoom meetings. So it's really cool. Is this Zoom?
It's actually Google. It's one of the things that come with the Google Drive platform that you can. Let's see, not sure if you can do it from here. No, maybe not. Well, there's like a little box of squares on your, if you have a Gmail or whatever, and you can click on that. It has all their products, and Jamboard is one of them, and it's pretty easy to work with. So. All right, well, it looks like things slowed down. So this is looking pretty great. I'll summarize these, put these on a table, and it'll go into our final plan. It's something I just wanted to make sure that we recorded for posterity at the beginning of this process before we moved too far along. So feel free to continue contributing to that. And I'm going to move forward and talk about our vulnerability assessment methodology. a little bit. And for that, we're going to continue to use the Jamboard. So if you scroll ahead to the next 4 slides, you'll see some more Jamboards, and they align with those dimensions of resilience that we talked about last time. So you can go ahead if you want to look ahead and start filling those out while I talk. You're welcome to do so, but I'm going to jump back to my slides here, and then I'm going to cover some information about vulnerability assessment methodology for a few slides, and then we can come back to the Jamboard as our last order of business and start filling out the Jamboard for our vulnerability assessment stuff. All right. So to recap from the last meeting, we talked about 4 dimensions of resilience, and this would have been a great activity to use the Jamboard for as well, but I didn't. So we just did it all on the slides there. But those 4 dimensions of resilience, the vulnerable populations, critical and environmental infrastructure, social factors, built infrastructure. So these were derived from the National Research Council report on disaster resilience. And they said that these are the 4 dimensions they identified critical to identifying resilience. This wasn't specific to coastal resilience or coastal hazards, so I don't think we have to be wedded to it at all, but it's just a good jumping off point to start to organize our thoughts for what needs to be assessed, what hasn't been assessed already in Tillamook, and what we might want to include in our assessment. So just to refresh everyone's mind, and for those who weren't here last time, when we talk about vulnerable populations, so these are factors that capture special needs of individuals and groups that are related to components such as minority status, socioeconomic status, health issues, mobility, etc. So you can see some of the opportunities for action that we identified there for Tillamook County: RV park, mobile home park, isolated communities that are communities that could become isolated given a road failure, the shellfish growers, evacuation limitations, language barriers, the tourism community, the homeless community. So these are some of the things that we put down last time. Critical and environmental infrastructure, this is kind of a broad category, but it's the ability of critical and environmental infrastructure to recover from events, components like water and sewage systems, transportation systems, power and communications. And then they also included all natural infrastructure in this as critical infrastructure. 3 social factors. So these are factors that enhance or limit a community's ability to recover, including things like social capital, education, language, governance, financial structures, cultural institutions, workforce aspects. So these are kind of all the things that impact our kind of day-to-day life that aren't absolutely critical. And then for the built infrastructure, so that's like all the other infrastructure that doesn't qualify as the critical, transportation and healthcare lifelines and things like that. So this is going to be, schools, homes, businesses, things like that. So this is all the stuff that we put down to get us thinking about how and what we need to evaluate. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the methods that we might use to conduct our vulnerability assessment. And I apologize. So I invited our project partner at the University of Oregon, Mike Howard, who is at the Institute for Policy Research and Engagement. And they are using they want a FEMA grant, a Cooperating Technical Partnership grant, to conduct vulnerability assessments in Coos Bay. And so they've been doing that for the last year already. And for our process down in Coos Bay, we're leveraging their vulnerability assessments down there for our part of our process, with the thought that we would participate down there and learn how to do the methods down there, and then we would adapt and replicate those methods in Tillamook County. And I invited Mike to come speak to you all today for him to describe their methods to you, but something came up and he wasn't able to attend this morning, so I'm going to have to talk about their methods a little bit. And so I apologize, I'm not as knowledgeable as Mike Howard is on their methods. So I'll give a pretty high level overview of those methods, but I did send out in the meeting materials, in the meeting brief, I kind of described that briefly, and then sent out some of the other documents that outline what they've been doing in Coos County and where they derive those methods from, which was a climate vulnerability assessment they did for the city of Eugene, following guidance from a few organizations. So let's talk a little bit about that. So we're going to determine our resilience needs in Tillamook County by assessing vulnerability of sectors and assets that haven't been evaluated yet in that other work that we identified that was conducted in Tillamook County. So to do this, we're going to replicate and adapt those methods that are now being conducted in Coos County by the IPRE. In 2013, the IPRE piloted those methods for the City of Eugene Climate Vulnerability Assessment, or CVA, and they followed guidance from the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives, or ICLEI. So there's a big guidebook that ICLEI put out. I linked to it in the meeting brief from the first meeting, possibly in the second one, I don't recall. And they also followed the guidance from EPA's Preparing for Climate Change, which is the same guide that TEP used to conduct their vulnerability assessment. So a lot of these vulnerability assessment methods articulate very well with one another. So the Tillamook Climate Vulnerability Assessment identified risk pathways that were mainly focused on impacts to focal natural resources, so water, forest, fisheries, wildlife. And our assessment can complement and be incorporated with this. So currently, IPRE, like I mentioned, they're adapting those methods from the Eugene CVA in Coos County, and we'll attempt to replicate and adapt those, a similar version for Tillamook County, probably a much more simplified version that will fit our study area with Tillamook County priorities that are identified by our local stakeholders, filling any potential gaps in understanding of our adaptive capacity, sensitivity, vulnerability in those dimensions identified on the previous slide, of course, with an eye toward natural infrastructure solutions. So the components of the evaluation or a vulnerability assessment, we're going to look at sensitivity, adaptive capacity, and risk. And you can see those defined here on the right. So sensitivity is the degree to which a natural, built, or human system is affected either adversely or beneficially by direct or indirect exposures to climate change conditions or hazards. And that will be combined with adaptive capacity, which is a natural built or human system's ability to accommodate a new or changing environment, exploit beneficial opportunities, and or moderate negative effects. And those will be combined with risk, which is the degree of impact on a natural built or human system weighed against the probability of impact from the same conditions. And all those will be combined to give us our vulnerabilities score. So that's the extent to which a natural, built, or social system is susceptible to damage from climate change under the or any hazard in this instance. Under this framework, a highly vulnerable system would be one that is highly sensitive to modest changes. So the tools that we'll use to accomplish this are listed there. So we're going to use a survey effort and potentially listening sessions and or interviews, individual interviews. So for the survey effort, it's a questionnaire that we can distribute online. And the way that they did it for Eugene and for Coos Bay is vulnerability was assessed through a stakeholder survey effort that assess these dimensions, these adaptive capacity and sensitivity and risk. And the results establish a baseline of information that helps inform follow-up listening sessions and individual interviews to get a better idea, greater context to stakeholder feelings about these evaluation components. The respondents identified their top hazards of concern, as well as perceived risk of a list of coastal hazards. They also described the assets that they saw as most vulnerable and identified any planning activities associated with their sector. The participants were divided into groups based on their sector and invited to participate then in follow-up sector-specific listening sessions. The listening sessions and individual interviews served as an opportunity for participants to clarify and add to their survey responses, as well as inform the risk evaluation. In addition to fostering discussion and awareness of climate vulnerability, the listening sessions had two main objectives. One, to confirm and clarify which assets and resources are most vulnerable, and two, to discuss the impacts of hazards on the study area. The listening sessions for Coos County were conducted via Zoom. They're very small, 5 to 7 people in each one, and they took about 2 hours per sector. Individual interviews were utilized for those participants who were unable to attend listening sessions. So these are some of the tools that we can use to evaluate sensitivity, adaptive capacity, and risk, which will then combine to understand vulnerability of a particular sector or group of assets. So here we see there's a flow chart on the right there of the methods that were piloted in the Eugene CVA. It's a very detailed process with multiple survey efforts evaluating each sector's vulnerability by calculating a score to be compared across sectors. One of our tasks today is to identify some of the stakeholders and partners beyond all of you that we can invite to participate in a similar assessment, albeit much more simplified. So this is the kind of loosely defined review committees that I've talked about participating in this process, whereas you're the working group kind of shaping how we develop this plan. The review committees will be broader stakeholder representation within the community that will have specific knowledge, specialized knowledge to tell us what the vulnerabilities and sensitivities, adaptive capacities, et cetera, are of their sectors and their assets. So once we've identified our participants, they can later be sorted into their respective sectors to compare a relative degree of vulnerabilities, which will help us prioritize potential adaptation actions. The primary sectors that were evaluated or identified in Coos County were natural resources, planning, schools and community centers, and infrastructure. So for Tillamook County, we may identify similar sectors or different sectors, fewer or more, it doesn't matter. It just depends on who's participating, where we see the need, and where the gaps are with respect to what's already been evaluated for Tillamook County. So the Eugene CVA that outlined in this flowchart, this is very intense. It was much more fine-grained than what is going on in Coos County, and certainly much more fine-grained than what we will need to do for Tillamook County. So don't be too intimidated by it. The Coos County adaptation was much simpler. They pared it down from multiple survey efforts to just a single survey. I think there's only 8 questions on their survey, so pretty straightforward. And they had smaller listening sessions. They only did 1 listening session per sector, whereas for Eugene, they did multiple. It just ended up being too big of a burden. So we can follow that model of being simplified, straightforward, and it doesn't have to eat up too much of our project timeline. For evaluation of the data that we'll get back, the responses we get back, the response information identified the community assets, which were then divided into 3 categories based on those responses. And these categories for Coos County were the built environment, natural resources, and social assets. So adaptive capacity, sensitivity, and risk were scored from these responses by calculating averages from the survey responses. And then they follow the basic calculation scheme that's outlined here in the flow chart. The combined scored measures of adaptive capacity, sensitivity to hazards of concern, and risk associated with each hazard gives us the vulnerability of the assets that are identified. And vulnerability is further assessed by applying a qualitative 5-point scale with assigned ranks from very low to low, medium, high, very high. So that at the end of it all, we can have a quantitative score that we can bin out into these qualitative measures. So we can say that the vulnerability for the social assets sector is high, and compare that to the vulnerability of the natural resources sector, which might be low, for example. So it just kind of gives people a relative qualitative measure. It's much easier to deal with, a little more wieldy when we're trying to talk about it and plan for specific actions. So I'll pause there. Any questions so far about our methods, our tools, and what we're talking about doing?
It seems very thorough.
Thank you. I'm sure Mike Howard could give a much better explanation, a little more thorough and detailed, but that's okay. I'll try to get him in our January meeting and he can talk a little bit more about it. Yeah. All right, well, if there's no questions at the moment, I'll move ahead. So here's some example questions from the Coos County survey using what we call Likert type categorization. So you see on the left here a question. It says, what level of risk do the following current or projected coastal hazards pose? Consider your organization, its mission, and the resources it manages, and risk being a combination of the probability that an event will occur and the consequence of occurrence. So we have several categories on the left there: air quality, air temperature, ocean temperature and chemistry, invasive species, etc. And then the respondent or the participant can qualitatively assess the risk for each of those assets. And so these categories can then be assigned a number, and we can score them and calculate an average and combine that with results, other results to determine vulnerability. On the right there, you can see a different Likert type categorization for a different kind of question. On a scale of 1 to 5, how urgent or time sensitive is the need to reduce the risks of the most critical hazard? In your response, consider impacts to the most vulnerable assets and resources. So that goes from not urgent to extremely urgent. So this is just another way that we can use a questionnaire to qualitatively and quantitatively evaluate the perceived risk of a particular hazard. And then the final question there right below is a more narrative response question. So this is something that an open-ended text box they can answer. It says, what assets or resources are most vulnerable to the coastal hazards you chose in a previous question, and consider the following in your response. So this information can be used not only to qualitatively provide context, but we do have methods if we choose to utilize them where we can do textual analysis and we can code their responses for certain things and kind of extrapolate or extract rather a quantitative score for a narrative response as well. And that can be factored into our calculations, our assessments of vulnerability. So I have a bit of experience doing this. In fact, for my master's research, there was a big component of that that I conducted. So so I know for a lot of folks when they say, "Oh, how can you do that?" It can be done. So don't worry too much about that. I can coordinate with Mike Howard on how we're going to do that and what needs to be included and not included, and we'll do a write-up for it of our methods in our final plan. But we can discuss some of that in the next couple of meetings as we develop this tool and implement it. So, and then thinking ahead as far as that goes, this is our kind of timeline now for the next few steps. So this is our broader timeline for the entire project. But in the next couple of months, what we'll aim to do is by our January meeting, have the survey questions and listening session questions written up, drafted, send those to you ahead of the meeting so we have time to read through them, think about them. Are we asking the right things? Are we missed anything? Are we asking in the right way? What kinds of responses might we expect to get? And in that way, we can kind of test it out ourselves to see what kinds of responses we get, and we can test out our scoring methodology as well and work that out. And so then hopefully In February, between the January and February meetings, we will be able to deploy this survey and maybe even review the results depending on how much time we give our respondents, whether it's 2 weeks or 30 days. 30 days would probably be appropriate. And then we can also start to coordinate our listening sessions with our participants, get those scheduled, possibly conducted in the February to March timeframe. And then we can, and in that time frame, be reviewing and evaluating results as well, so that by sometime, maybe by the March meeting, we will have our survey responses. We will have conducted our listening sessions, and then we will be, consolidating and writing up all of our results there. In order to move forward with that, then we're going to jump back to the Jamboard. And this will be kind of the last thing that I needed to accomplish with everyone today. So if you scroll over to page 4 of the Jamboard, so we have 4 slides, and they articulate with those 4 dimensions of resilience that we've talked about. And I already started by putting some sticky notes on these on the left side under opportunities for action. So these are all of the things that we identified in the previous meeting, and I just plugged them into the Jamboard here to get it going. A few of them had specific places identified. So at the top we have places, so if you can think of specific places that we want to focus on. So for vulnerable populations, we identified mobile home parks and the Nesquin RV Park, for example. But then what we really need to do today is identify the specific hazards for each of these dimensions and the stakeholders and partner groups that we want to include potentially in our vulnerability assessment. So when we think about vulnerable populations, who is an organization or a partner or stakeholder that we can reach out to say, hey, can you tell us what are the vulnerabilities of your assets? What are the risks to hazards that we've identified here? What are what's the adaptive capacity and the sensitivity of your assets? So this is how we're going to kind of start to narrow our scope for the vulnerability assessment. So go through each of those: vulnerable populations, critical and environmental infrastructure, social factors, and built infrastructure, and start to fill out especially the hazards and the stakeholders and partners dimensions of each of those. And if it helps, if you scroll to the right, the rest of the slides just have some helpful information for folks that I thought I would drop in there to kind of help to get you thinking. So like, here's a slide about hazards. So the thing about hazards is we all kind of know what the hazards are that Tillamook County estuaries face. But it'd be good to kind of narrow the scope as much as we can to say, okay, vulnerable populations face these specific hazards, which might be different than what some of the other, the built infrastructure faces, for example, or whatever it might be. But I think the hazards are all going to be pretty similar, but I still wanted to give everyone an opportunity to identify maybe more fine-grained specific threats to each of those dimensions. So take a few minutes, go through each of those, and we'll talk about them as we go through. And try when you're identifying the stakeholders and the hazards, try and be as specific as possible as well. That'll be really helpful. I think flooding will be a big one all around, though. So I see on built infrastructure, one of the stakeholders, Tillamook County Public Works. So that's perfect. Very specific, somebody we can reach out to. So when we distribute our survey questionnaire, we can send it. We can identify specific staff members there that we can send it to solicit their feedback. ODOT as well. Yeah, a lot of the state agencies are going to be prime folks who are going to have a good understanding of their assets and the hazards and sensitivities that they face. So one of the other things too that I'll work up between now and January is that list of folks that we can reach out to, and I'll send that around to everybody and probably in a spreadsheet form, and that's something we can start to contribute, like a list of contacts that we can identify certain folks to reach out to. See, I see utilities, Tillamook PUD. What's PUD?
People's Utility District. It's our GE.
So I see on vulnerable populations, we have one of the hazards, ocean acidification. And my first thought is, well, I'm not sure how that connects, but then I look on opportunities for action, the shellfish growers, of course, in Netarts. I did my graduate work at the Whiskey Creek Shellfish Hatchery in Netarts. And of course, ocean acidification, that was my bread and butter. So that's definitely a very specific threat to a specific group of folks. Yeah, a lot of these community centers, are they in flood prone areas? Is there anything that's not in a flood prone area?
Some more so than others.
I think even our hospital is not in a good place.
That is true.
Well, I'm glad that we're in a position where we're talking about what might happen in the future rather than what's already happened. Although, of course, there's been a lot of flooding. I'm gonna contribute myself as well. I'm gonna put on built infrastructure here, Cascadia event, because I think, of course, that's going to be a big one for built infrastructure.
Well, I don't even know what could survive a tsunami. What kind of. It's hard to plan for that. Resilience.
Yeah, absolutely. well, as best we can, plan for projects that can absorb and redirect incoming floodwaters. Of course, there's only so much you can do for a tsunami event of that size.
Run away and then come back to the sea.
Mhm. Sure, I think anything we do for resiliency will help, but it likely will have more of an impact on the social resiliency and how we respond to the challenges and hazards.
Yeah, I agree. I'm pleased to see all the planning, and at least so people know to get the heck out of Dodge, when they get the call.
Mm-hmm.
So Moses, I don't know if you're aware, but the Tillamook County is embarking upon an update of our multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plan.
Yeah.
And I don't know how many people on this call is aware that that's happening and that we're covering a lot of the same stuff. And so it needs to, so I don't know how many people on this call are aware that that's happening. And in fact, Mike Sandin is actually sending the link to that plan. We're updating it. So I think that what you're doing is going to be more focused, I'm hoping.
Yeah.
More focused with clear and action plans. And so anyways, I just want to know that these are kind of in hand projects.
Yeah, no, thank you. Go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say one thing, Leanne and I were talking and we were both really part of that. And I don't know how many in here were part of that. It's that document is huge and it's almost overwhelming. It's one of the more required for FEMA than anything. However, a lot of what we're talking about was brought up in different spots in that. And I think at a bare minimum, if it might help if, nobody's going to read that thing cover to cover, but at least we sent the link. So maybe everybody on here could at least take a quick look at it before the next meeting, because we're talking about a lot of the exact same stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I had linked to it in the previous meeting briefing document too. But that's one of the things. So, once we get all this stuff on the page, not all of it's going to make it to what we eventually evaluate or who we include or don't include. So that's going to be one of the tasks I'm going to have here, is to take all this stuff and try and narrow the scope based on what's already been done. So I'm going to be, talking to people who worked on that plan, going through the plan myself. I think Lisa and Wei can help me with that a bit as well. But just to narrow the scope and say, okay, well, here we have A, B, and C have already been addressed in the natural hazard mitigation plan or in the TEP vulnerability assessment. So we can leave those out of ours, and that hopefully, will help us really narrow the scope of what we need to accomplish, which given all the really strong work that's been done in Tillamook, I don't think there's a ton of gaps that need to be filled. So, but
well,
I want to
yeah. If you don't mind me adding on that real quick, I think looking at it's a good thing, but unfortunately, it is such a huge and over-encompassing document right now that it's not getting much results out of it. It almost feels like we did. I'm totally supportive of it, and I'll be involved in the next version. But a lot of it was just done to keep FEMA happy. There's stuff in there we can pull out of there, but it is almost so overwhelming that it's hard to pin things down. So I think if we leave stuff out of this one that is important, it might get lost in the mix. So I think we just need to keep, I like where we're going with this because it's focused. I think there's gonna be some more results out of this, but I don't want to shave stuff out of there because it might not ever get touched if we do. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think maybe what we could do is, as I'm going through all this stuff, I can kind of set aside some of those the aspects and assets and hazards that we're identifying here and say, I think that these have been addressed, but everybody kind of give me your feedback, your review on whether we should exclude these or continue to include certain ones, just to make sure that they get evaluated appropriately or that they're included in this process. That I can do that if that works for everybody. And Lisa, says, I think it'll help to look at this as the more detailed action plan that implements resiliency around the estuarine hazards. It could be a subset of the natural hazard mitigation plan. So yeah, that's really how we're looking to utilize it to complement a lot of that other work.
I think that's a really good place to be for this. So I agree with Lisa. I think that this would be more of a focused with real actions. The other one is more of a plan that's 500 pages big. So thank you.
Yeah, I definitely don't want this, the final document here that we produce to be, you know, overwhelming like some of those other plans can be. And really, you know, I'm very focused on, like, let's get a list of projects that we can actually accomplish and move forward with. It doesn't have to be, you know, it doesn't have to address every hazard. It doesn't have to address every asset. And it doesn't have to be every possible project out there, but it's a list of, you know, essentially I want to bite off what we can chew here, and it'll be something that we can, you know, at the end of it, folks can get the funding they need, they can break ground, and they can point back and say, you know what, this process that we piloted in Tillamook really helped us get from A to Z on this. Because, you know, that's the other thing, this is a pilot process. We've not done anything quite like this before. And if, you know, we're going to take our lessons learned here at the end of our 2 years and say, well, this is what worked and didn't work. So for the other 5 coastal counties that haven't yet done this, they can look to the example of Tillamook and Coos and the efforts that we're doing right here to make their own action plans. So definitely a bit of an experimental process here when you know, we're leveraging and adapting a lot of other people's efforts to see what we can come up with. But I do think, you know, just kind of circling back, a big part of it is understanding what all the work that's already been done in each of the jurisdictions, and really kind of, you know, that graphic I have of the puzzle pieces, and we're just one of those pieces that's going to fit into all the existing planning work. So I'm not seeing a whole lot more sticky notes popping up. Try to fill out the social factors one. If you want, well, not if you want, but what I'll do after this, I'll send an email to everybody with the link to the Jamboard so that you can hang on to that. Feel free to continue contributing to the Jamboard over the next couple of weeks. If you're doing something and it pops in your head, you can just pull up the Jamboard and add to it. It's going to take a little bit of time to kind of collect all this work and write it up and start to plan for our next steps. So, you know, if you got an idea in the next week or two, feel free to pop it on there, and I'll check it a couple more times in the next few weeks. So, any other thoughts to throw out there? Social factors is looking a little light, so there might be more to add there potentially. And built infrastructure, that's of course one that, you know, gets probably the lion's share of the focus when it comes to hazard planning. And you know, I think there's a lot that we can do there to improve resiliency of built infrastructure using natural infrastructure. So I think there's a lot of potential there as well. All right, well, things seem to have slowed down, so I'm going to hop back here. And that was pretty much what we needed to accomplish today. So for the last bit of it, just the good of the order. So I just wanted to kind of open up the floor to everybody. If anyone has anything that they want to share that might be relevant to our process, or that you think would be good for us to know or to think about moving forward, now's the opportunity to do so.
I'll jump in real quick, just give everybody an update on the jetties if you want. But
yes, please.
A lot of people know we've been working really hard for the last 14 years to get the North Jetty, restored, South Jetty, sorry. We're just about there. The county and the port met with the Corps Monday to work out a lot of details for staging. There's definitely some environmental issues and some wetland issues that are going to be mitigated during the whole process. But the short version is, providing the money shows up in the checking account, we're looking for about $62 million. The hope is that the contract's going to be going out to bid here March, April of this year, and rock procurement will be starting soon after that, with construction on the South Jetty starting in 23, 24 timeframe. So end of 22, 23 timeframe, and then in 24. We've also been working with them over the last quite a few years about getting the bar dredged, because our whole goal is to make sure, aside from the jetties being safe, that we've got improved flow for the boat basin. One of the things we've pointed out and we've used is examples from the East Coast about beach restoration, and they've agreed about taking the spoils from the bar when they dredge it and starting to line a reef off of Rockaway Beach to help break up some of the wave activity to help minimize the impacts of erosion on Rockaway Beach area. So we're definitely moving forward with a few things that are pretty cool that have an impact on this whole process.
Awesome, thank you.
I just wanted to comment on the work we've done even today of identifying stakeholders and partners. I think this is going to be incredibly useful going forward, getting survey results from a really broad range of people who care about estuarine resilience. This is great.
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, the stakeholders and partners, that's a big one to remember. As I mentioned, if you think of anything in the next week or two, because I'm not integrated into the Tillamook community there, so I'm really leaning on all of you to kind of tell me who we need to include here and who's going to have that perspective and specialized knowledge that we can leverage.
Hey, Leanne, it's Mike. Would you want to fill him in on the TEP Center? Because I think that's a big part in this as we move forward. When this TEP Center of Excellence gets done as a ground zero for a lot of this.
Yeah, and so what we're doing is we're trying to plan a estuary education center that houses TEP, our organization, our staff, try and maybe build a new lab as part of that, conference center, education, and maybe even a marketing. So we've gone through the first phase of the architectural, like site planning. We found a site. We're actually going to try and trade places where the Port of Garibaldi is with TEP's office. That's, I think, where we've landed. And now we're moving forward within the second phase of that project. So we're actually got some new money from EPA that's going to help us move that project a little bit forward and hire somebody to do marketing, another couple $1 million that we need to raise. So that's, to me, it's a really exciting project for our community.
That sounds
awesome.
Awesome.
Colin, do you want to add anything to that?
I'm just very excited for the lab space, to be honest. But that's me. That's my personal bias. And I think it's going to be fantastic just for a spot. I mean, tons of people are coming in, just knocking on our door anyways, for information about the area. And if we have a formal space for that to happen in, that's also an outreach area, I think it's just going to grow the outreach impact and what we can talk to people with in the community. I'm super excited to be getting in on the ground floor of this.
That sounds great. Thank you for sharing. All right. Any other anything to share for the good of the order?
One more thing is that the city of Bay City is working with, I think it's DLCD, on a grant to do our phase 2 of our ordinance development update. So one of the things David Madison is going to be doing is leading the city of Bay City through an ordinance update. So if, I'm not sure how that timing is going to work out, but really, some of the things that would come out of this, this effort, how would we change our ordinance to have more resiliency in our estuaries. I mean, because Bay City is right on the bay. We discharge to the bay. Our stormwater goes out to the bay. So I'm really looking at this to help guide through some of that ordinance update for us.
All right, yeah, well, that sounds good. Yeah, we can talk a little bit more about that as well at some point and see how we might be able to integrate those efforts together. All right, anything else? All right, well, like I mentioned, looking ahead to January, I'll try to write up some of our results here and start drafting some survey questions, listening session questions, and those tools that we will want to use for our vulnerability assessment. And we can review those in our January meeting, and then hopefully plan for to implement those and start reaching out to those partners and stakeholders for inclusion in that. So. Thank you, everybody, for your time today. I'll give you a little bit of time back in your morning. I really appreciate seeing you all, and happy holidays.
Yes, you too. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you next time.
Happy holidays. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.